Now they started drilling this 7-mile hole into the earth in 1970, and they drilled it on the Kola Peninsula in Russia. And so they coined this thing the Kola Super Deep Borehole, which a borehole is going to be a really narrow hole. And this was a really narrow hole, only 9 inches in diameter. But the goal was to live up to that name, super deep, because the ultimate goal was to drill as far to the earth as they could possibly get. But again, they only made it 40,000 feet, 7 miles. So not only did they not reach the core, they didn't even reach the mantle, and they only made it about halfway through the crust, less than 1% of the distance into the earth. And just to get that far, it took them 20 years. They drilled from 1970 all the way to 1992 until they had to abruptly stop in 1992 because the temperatures at that depth just got way too hot, over 356 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so hot that the drill bit couldn't even go any further. Because of that extreme heat, the rock at this level was like elastic. They would drill into it and it would just immediately contract right back into shape. And this was wreaking havoc on the equipment. So they were going to need a different drill bit to continue to drill this hole, something that we just didn't have yet, because they were using high carbon steel to drill this hole. And at that 40,000 foot mark, it just could not penetrate the earth any further. And the funding just wasn't there to continue. They already spent over $50 million. So everything stops at that 40,000 foot mark. Not even 1% into the earth. 7 miles. Just 1 mile deeper than the Mariana Trench. This is the deepest that we've ever physically penetrated into the earth. So we've only been able to physically observe less than 1% of what's actually going on inside the earth. And again, everything that we know about the earth's inner structure is based off of the data from seismic waves. And of course, seismic waves are formed from earthquakes. When an earthquake hits, it sends these waves throughout the entire body of the earth. And when these waves move through the earth, they move either as a P wave or an S wave. Now, P waves are going to be known as primary waves because they travel through the earth the fastest. So they're going to be the first waves or the primary waves to move their way through the earth. And then right behind them, you have the S waves, or in other words, the secondary waves, traveling about 60% slower than those P waves. And they use these waves to make assumptions about what is going on inside the earth. Basically, by looking at how these waves pass through objects on the surface. Because again, P waves travel the fastest and they move through liquids, solids, and gases, while S waves are moving slower and can only move through solid objects. Now, to monitor the movement of these waves, they've got these seismic stations strategically placed all over the world. Hundreds of these seismic stations that link together to create this global seismographic network. And through these stations, they're able to monitor where a wave begins, where it ends, and just how long it takes to get from one point to the next. And from that, they're able to determine exactly what type of wave it is. Now, originally they assumed that the inside of the earth was just pure rock all the way through. But once they started getting these seismographic readings, they noticed that the wave patterns within the earth were suggesting that there was some type of layers to the earth. And over time, they had already assumed that the earth was layered, but this was the first time that they actually had some type of tangible evidence. They looked at this data and saw that the further these waves moved into the earth, these S waves that could only move through solids would suddenly just stop. And because this was happening right at the center of the earth, they saw that as proof that there's got to be some type of separate liquid core at the center of the earth, because the P waves were moving straight through the center of the earth, again suggesting that there was something liquid in that area. As these waves moved through the earth, they would all of a sudden hit these points in the earth where the waves would just speed up and bounce in different directions. And so they call these areas seismic discontinuities. And because after each one of these discontinuities, the waves would go back to moving at a normal pace. Again, this was seen as more proof the inside of the earth was layered. And this is ultimately how we got that picture of the structure of the inner earth that we know today. But again, all of this is theoretical based off of what can be mapped out using these seismic waves. And as far as being able to physically observe what may be going on inside the earth, the only physical evidence that we have is volcanoes. You know, when volcanoes erupt, we can physically see that magma shoot out from the interior of these volcanoes. And by the time it hits the surface, this stuff is burning at temperatures of like 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's very clearly traveling out from within the earth, usually in these insane amounts, you know, anywhere between 13 to 53 gallons per second. And sometimes these volcanoes can flow for months, sometimes even years. So we know for sure that that magma is moving within the earth on a large scale. So you would think all of this magma and all of this volcanic activity would be coming from deep within the earth at the core. But as they've been able to study volcanoes more, what they found is that all the magma that we see is coming from the lower part of the earth's crust and the upper part of the mantle. There's really no signs that any of this volcanic activity is forming anywhere lower than the upper mantle. And you would think that if the entire crust of the earth and the entire upper mantle had the same composition, the same temperatures, that we should be seeing this volcanic activity pretty much everywhere. But actually 75% take place within a tightly lined 25,000 mile radius of each other. And it is literally a line. It's like a horseshoe shaped line that loops back around almost in a perfect session in this one specific region of the world. And then the other 25% is scattered around it. But this is where more than 2/3 of the world's volcanic activity is occurring. And one way to look at this is worldwide, there's over 800 actively confirmed volcanoes. And within this ring of fire, you can find over 500 of them. Again, 75%, all restricted to this one area. And then in this same region is where you're also going to find 90% of all the world's earthquakes. Literally 90% of every single earthquake that has ever happened has happened within this ring of fire region. And you got just 10% scattered out nearby. But the majority of all the earthquakes that the earth has ever experienced are in this one region. And again, you would think if we got the same composition, the same temperatures spread throughout the entire crust, the entire mantle, that more of these earthquakes and more of these volcanoes should be spread out across the world to a greater degree. But that's not what we're seeing. We literally have this uniformly shaped ring where the majority of all of this activity is taking place. And it would seem to go without saying that with all of these earthquakes, all of these volcanoes occurring within this specific tight-knit region, that we would be able to know fairly quickly and, you know, pretty accurately when these volcanoes are going to erupt and these earthquakes are going to strike, especially as our ability to map the earth with seismic data has increased. And it is amazing what these geologists and seismologists are able to do. But even with all the advancements in seismology, they have never been able to predict when an earthquake is going to happen. And they say that's something that they don't expect to be able to do anytime, even in the foreseeable future. They have no idea when, where, or even how large an earthquake is going to be. They can make estimates of where an earthquake may be likely to strike, but they really don't know when these events are going to happen. No seismologist, no geologist has ever been able to predict an earthquake. And it's the same thing with volcanoes. They're trying to find ways to figure it out, but they still have no way of successfully predicting when or where a volcano is going to erupt, or even how long that volcano eruption is going to last. And this right here just kind of gives you a clear idea of just how little they are really able to understand about what is going on inside the earth. And it wasn't until very recently that we've actually finally had the ability to thermally map the interior of the earth. And figuring this out took them over 8 years. 8 years to completely thermally map the earth. But what they found is that there is literally just one giant formation that all of the Earth's magma is coming from. And they basically call it like a massive subterranean tree. This one magma tree that every single volcano on the earth is attached to, like branches attached to a tree. And again, because the majority of the Earth's volcanoes are all confined to one isolated region of the earth, this giant magma tree is also confined to a very specific region within the earth. It's like a tightly knitted network of magma confined to this specific area and moving through this tree-like structure, almost like fluid moving through a vein. And again, it took them 8 years to figure this out. So once again, it just shows how they really do not have a full grasp on what is really going on down there. And we know we've had stories about what is potentially going on below us, stretching all the way back to ancient times. One of the oldest that you'll find is in Hinduism. They separate the different realms of existence into lokas. So the lower and higher realms are separated into these lokas, or into these worlds, 14 separate worlds. And on the 7th level is the earth, the Bhuloka. And then under the earth is the 7 lower lokas, these 7 subterranean realms that are all ruled by demons. And pretty much right in the middle of these realms, you have Sutaloka, which is ruled by the demon king, Bali. And Bali used to be a king on Bhuloka, the earth, who was banished down to this realm by the gods. So these 7 lower lokas are seen as this demonic realm, a place where only demons reside and where the gods send their enemies. Then we've got Tartarus in Greek mythology, which is supposed to be the lowest point in the universe. This dark abyss underground that is basically like a subterranean prison for all the enemies of the gods. And when the Titans and the Olympians battle and the Titans are defeated, the Titans are sent down to Tartarus, and Tartarus becomes a prison for the Titans, almost all the Titans, including Kronos. Kronos is imprisoned in Tartarus after being defeated by Zeus, and he remains locked up underground in the lowest part of the universe until he manages to escape and emerges back onto the earth as Saturn, where we get that golden age under the god Saturn that the Greeks talk about. Then when you look at Buddhism, Taoism, you have the Dayu, which literally translates to earth prison. What they say is an earth prison deep underground where beings are sent to suffer for their crimes. And it's literally described as a subterranean maze, similar to the world above, but covered in darkness. Basically a prison for the damned. Then we got the Dogon that talk about the Andembulu, these beings that are the offspring of Ogo, which is basically the equivalent of Satan, and the offspring of Mother Earth. So Ogo and Mother Earth unified to form these beings. And these beings actually end up being the very first humans. And they describe them as looking like pygmies, which the pygmy tribe in Africa grows to about an average height of 5 feet. So they describe them as similar to the pygmies, but with massive heads, that they were spiritually like snakes, and that at some point they retreated into the underworld. And the Mayans talk about Xibalba, an underground realm that is ruled by the god Kaizen, the god of death and the god of earthquakes. And supposedly they would make sacrifices to this god because they have found what looks like, gifts and even human remains left inside caves in the Yucatan, which they say was believed to be entrances to Xibalba. And so, they say maybe these were offerings to the gods. But something really interesting is when you look at depictions of Kaizen, he looks very similar to the Dogon's depiction of the Ndambulu. The large head, the short stature, and again, being confined to the subterranean, underground. And then, of course, you got a lot of other stories about the ancient underworld. With the Egyptians, you got the Duat, the Sumerians had Ker, but a lot of these places were dealing with life after death, some type of realm beyond this physical plane. When it gets down to these physical descriptions of the underworld on this physical plane, over and over again, it's described as some sort of earthly prison where these dark entities reside. And then if you fast forward a little bit, the first time we ever see some sort of alternative scientific hypothesis on what may be going on inside the earth is from the astronomer Edmund Halley. This is the guy that's credited with figuring out a way to measure the distances between two planetary bodies, specifically the earth and the sun, and also helping Isaac Newton publish the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which gets into laws of motion, universal gravitation. But what made him a much bigger name was when he was able to predict the exact day and the exact time that a comet was going to pass over the earth, because he said, based on his observations, this comet had a 76-year orbit around the sun. And he was able to predict that this comet would pass over the earth again in 1758. And that prediction has been proven right ever since. Every 76 years, this comet consistently passes over the earth. So because of this successful prediction, they named this comet Halley's Comet. And Halley is also credited with being the first person to create a liquid compass, which ultimately stabilizes the compass needle and makes the compass easier to read. And this was in 1692. And when he started using this compass, he noticed something was off, that the compass readings were like fluctuating like crazy toward the North and the South poles, and pretty much theorized that the only way that these crazy fluctuations could be occurring is if the earth has multiple magnetic poles. And he determined that in order for that to be the case, that about 4/9 of the earth would have to be a cavity. So basically about 99.9% of the earth would have to be hollow. And that 1% would be these concentric shells, these separate layers of concentric shells. And each one of these shells or spheres were rotating at different speeds. And he hypothesized that each one of these shells were about 800 kilometers thick, with an individual atmosphere that separated each shell, like an atmosphere between each shell. And that this is possibly where the southern lights and the northern lights were coming from the gases released from these atmospheres. And this theory caught on so much that the Royal Society of London actually approved an expedition to go check this out to see if it was scientifically valid. And they actually gave Edmund Halley access to a Royal Navy ship, along with an entire naval crew, to go investigate this. And they even made him the temporary captain for this expedition. And the ship that they gave him was called the Paramour. And this wasn't just any type of regular ship. This was a naval warship armed with over 6 cannons. And so they set off on this voyage in 1698. And the first time they sail out, before they could even get halfway, they have to stop and turn the boat around because one of the crew members tries to start a mutiny on the ship. So they have to turn the boat around and take him back to be court-martialed. So after that first voyage gets postponed, they sail out again. And this time they make it all the way to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean before they again have to turn around. So they make it to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, but they do not make it to the poles because the ship they were in couldn't handle the terrain. Because remember, we're talking about the late 1600s, before we had icebreaker ships, which are designed to move through that type of terrain that you're going to see at the poles. So this theory just kind of goes dormant for a while. We don't really hear anything more about it until somewhere between the 1700s and 1800s, when we get this mathematician named Leonard Euler, the guy credited with coming up with all these different mathematical equations, topology, graph theory, calculus of variations. And there's controversy as to whether or not he actually proposed this idea. But supposedly, he also proposed the idea that instead of the Earth being filled with multiple concentric shells like Halley was proposing, that instead it was just one single hollow shell with one small glowing core right at the center that basically served as a sun. And supposedly he suggested that we can find entrances to the inside of the Earth at both the North and the South poles. Then we got another mathematician named Sir John Leslie, who comes out around the same time and offers his own theory where he adds back in those concentric shells, but he adds two separate suns between those shells. So at this point in history, we're getting quite a few academics that are pushing this theory. And then a little later into the 1800s, we get John Cleves Sims. And Sims was the captain of the 1st Infantry for the U.S. military during the War of 1812, which was basically a war between the United States and Britain. Because around this time, the United States was starting to move in on the Native Americans, trying to seize control of the rest of the lands in the Americas that were being occupied by the natives. And of course, the natives were fighting back. So this whole thing turned into one huge war between the U.S. and the natives of America. And the U.S. believed that Britain was supplying weapons to the Native Americans to kind of give them a leg up during this war. So the U.S. and Britain go to war, but it doesn't last long. And eventually they sign a peace treaty, and the U.S. and Britain end up joining together, and they both move in and wage war on the natives. And once the natives are removed from these lands, the U.S. and Britain divide ownership of these territories between each other. And it's estimated that over 56 million natives were killed during this war. And again, John Cleves Sims captains the 1st Infantry during this war. But then after the war, he's honorably discharged. And not long after this, he starts coming out and just starts claiming that he believes that the Earth is hollow and that there are entrances into the Earth at both the North and the South poles. And he was relentlessly campaigning this idea to the point where he actually sent out a declaration of his belief that the Earth was hollow to every single college, every single government official, every prominent scientist. And he had this thing printed in every single national newspaper. And he even had a certificate attached to this thing professing his sanity, like basically letting people know I am sane and I really do believe this. And in this declaration, he said he believed that within the Earth were these solid concentric shells, just like Edmund Halley suggested. And again, that you could get in through the North and the South Pole. And he literally said he pledged his life to this idea and that he was ready to go explore the inside of the Earth. And he already had a whole expedition mapped out. He was asking for like 100 people to join him, that they would start in Siberia in the fall and then head toward the poles. And he believed that in the poles, they were going to find warm, rich land with vegetation and animals, possibly even human life. And he was so determined to make this thing happen that he actually petitioned Congress for funding to start this expedition. And here's the thing, his father was a judge and his uncle was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. So he was actually able to get the vice president at the time to present this idea to the Senate. So the idea for this expedition was put on the Senate floor 3 times, and all 3 times it was shot down until the actual president of the United States at the time, John Quincy Adams, actually agreed to fund this expedition. But this was during the last year of his term as president. And before the expedition can actually be put into action, John Quincy Adams is voted out of office. And when the new president, Andrew Jackson, is brought in, the funding for this expedition is completely scrapped. And Sims ends up passing away in 1829, literally 2 months after John Quincy Adams is voted out as president. But this guy named Jeremiah Reynolds, basically his right-hand man, continues walking in Sims' footsteps, pushing and campaigning for this expedition. And eventually the Senate is like, look, we will fund this expedition. But in order for us to fund it, we need you to remove all of the hollow earth aspects. This will be an expedition to explore the polar regions. There's not going to be some talk about hollow earth or, giant holes located at the poles. This is strictly a polar region expedition. So ultimately, they approved this expedition to go explore the polar regions, but they actually do not include Reynolds. They tell Reynolds, we appreciate you pushing for this expedition, but, your services are no longer needed. So in 1838, the U.S. military sets out on what they call the United States Exploring Expedition with over 490 naval officers and over 6 first-rate warships. And this expedition lasted 4 years. And within those 4 years, they reported so many casualties, mostly people that were native to the areas that they were entering, that they were killing. There was at least close to 80 natives in Fiji that were killed alone. And once this expedition is done, they don't report seeing any openings at the poles, anything dealing with Earth being hollow or anything like that. But they do report the very first definitive sighting of Antarctica. And that we can solidly confirm that within the southern polar region, there is an icy continent. But again, even the best naval ships at the time could not handle that terrain. Again, we still didn't have highly advanced enough icebreaker ships at this point in history. So they could confirm that the continent was there, but they couldn't actually enter it. And they never even made it to the North Pole. And of course, Sims, the person that was originally pushing to make this happen, doesn't even live to see it. But he is buried with full military honors. And right after his burial, his son actually pushes to have a monument built around his grave. And since 1829, this monument has been sitting in Hamilton, Ohio, in what is now known as Sims Park. Literally, the entire park is named after John Cleve Sims. They even named the road that the park is located on after Sims. And it used to be a cemetery, but every single body was removed except Sims. Sims is the only grave left on this site. It is literally one of the oldest public memorials in the United States, and it's located right in the center of the park. And they're serious about keeping this thing up because in 1991, they performed a $16,000 renovation on this memorial. So people were really fascinated with Sims and this whole idea of a hollow earth. And you have to question, with Sims being so involved with the invasion and occupation of those native lands, did he hear something or see something that caused him to really believe that there's something major going on at the poles? But this thing really started to catch people's attention, which led us into getting books like Journey to the Center of the Earth and all different other types of fiction about what is going on inside the earth. It was a big thing around this time in history. In 1886, we get the story of Agartha by Marcus St. Ives. And in that book, he's talking about this super technologically advanced inner earth civilization. And just like Sims, he was adamant that this was real. A lot of speculation, but you got to remember this was before seismographs and we could actually see those seismic waves. But what's crazy is what those waves are showing us. These separate layers of concentric spheres is almost an identical match to what Haley and Sims were talking about before we were able to even use seismic waves to see it. And, it's not an exact science, but at the same time, it does give us a general idea of what Earth's inner structure is. And it's just more evidence that there's definitely solid elements deeper into the earth beyond the crust. And then we just see physically what happens when any elements are placed in a microgravity environment, an environment that mimics a vacuum. We always see fundamental forces act on those particles and create a spherical object. by pressing and compacting all of those elements together into a solid form, which kind of explains why the sun, the moon, all the planets are spherical objects. All of those elements are being compacted together. And you can see pretty much any element added into that sphere is going to conform to it. But also what you're going to notice is the more elements that you add to the interior of that sphere, the less solid it becomes. You start seeing pockets or cavities forming within that sphere. All those elements mixing creates these voids within that sphere. And when we look at the Earth as far below as the crust, this is something that we can definitely see. These deep extended cavities within the Earth, which we see as caves and caverns. And we know most caves are made from water. When it becomes acidic, even if it's just the least bit acidic, over time it starts to dissolve that rock. And that's how these cavities or these openings start to form within that rock. And there's other ways that these cavities can form, but in general, wherever you have rock and some type of element or some type of force acting on it, you have the potential for caves to form. But most of the caves that we see are formed from water dissolving into rocks. And we know overall the planet Earth is a giant rock that constantly has water flowing through it. And so because of this, we have millions of caves and caverns all over the planet. And most of these caves are ancient and formed like millions of years ago. One of the oldest cave systems that we know of is the Sudwala caves in Mpumalanga in South Africa. This whole cave system is supposed to be about 240 million years old and is still standing today. This thing is over 492 feet into the ground and stretches for over 18 miles. But if you go in as a tourist, you only get access to about 2,000 feet, which is not even 1 mile. So we have no clue what is beyond the rest of those 18 miles. But they say they stop it at that 1 mile to help preserve the cave. Because again, this is one of the most ancient sites on the planet. But again, this is one of the oldest caves. The oldest that we know of goes back another 100 million years. And that's the Jenolan Caves in Australia. This cave system dates back to 340 million years ago. So this would have been before the dinosaurs even first appeared on the planet. And it's above ground in most spots, but it goes down about 39 feet underground. And it stretches for about 200 feet. So it's got multiple different chambers attached to it. And one of those chambers is called the Temple of Baal. And the name Baal is actually a reference to an ancient god. And the name is used to describe multiple gods. And ultimately it is connected to demons and the devil. Because one of the aspects of the god Baal was that it required human sacrifice. Kind of like Kaizen in Xibalba in Mexico. And they say they gave this chamber that name because of all the distorted features within it and because it has the largest known Shaw calcite formation inside the cave system. They call this thing an angel wing, and it is over 29 meters long. And they connect it with Baal being a fallen angel. And of course, we've got caves that go even deeper into the earth. In Georgia, between Europe and Asia, right around the Caucasus Mountains, we've got Varalkina Cave, which drops down 7,257 miles into the earth. And it's the deepest cave that we know of on the earth. It takes over 4 days and thousands of feet of rope to get down to the bottom. And as you move through it, it's got all these tight, narrow passageways that lead into these massive, large, open spaces. Because we're talking about so many different chambers and passageways, just different layers of this cave that you have to traverse through to even make it to the bottom. And then of course in Kentucky, you've got Mammoth Cave, which isn't the deepest, but it's definitely one of the longest caves that we know of. This cave system stretches about 400 miles. And that's just what's been explored so far. There's supposed to be another 600 miles of unexplored chambers within this cave system. This cave is so long that you could literally combine the second and third largest caves And this would still be the longest known cave system in the world. It's got a 5,000-acre subterranean lake inside of it. If you tour the cave, they have a point where they turn all the lights off in the cave to show what, the explorers saw when they first found it, and to show what these deep subterranean cave systems are like in their natural state without artificial light. And once those lights go out, it is literally pitch black. You are surrounded by complete and total darkness everywhere you look. It just gives you an idea of just how dark these caves can get. But yeah, this cave is massive. Again, it's the longest cave that we know of in the world. And there's actually speculation that the surrounding cave systems may actually be connected to this cave, which will make it even longer. So we really don't know how far this cave stretches. And it's the same thing with Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. Still have no clue how long this cave system actually is. The length still hasn't been fully mapped out. All they know for sure is that it drops over 1,000 feet into the earth. They actually have an elevator installed into the cave to help people reach the bottom because of how deep this thing is. And again, the majority of these caves formed from water passing through rocks. It's not the only way that they can form. You've also got caves that are formed by lava. After a volcano stops erupting, the lava that's flowing on the surface starts to cool and turns into this hard basalt rock. But underneath that, you still have molten liquid lava flowing underneath for about as long as the volcano continues to erupt. And as the lava flows through and, eventually drains out, it creates a hollow space underground that they literally call lava tubes, because it is like a tube, like a long passageway that is completely formed by lava. And of course, Hawaii has some of the largest lava tubes in the world. The biggest one that we know of is called the Kazamura Cave. This thing is 40 miles long and over 3,600 feet deep. And this thing has more than 100 entrances. And once you get in, it is insanely complex. Straight paths, curves, arches, plateaus, all these complex elements to it, almost as if somebody carved it out. But all of this is created by lava. You got roots from trees that embed themselves into the caves. It is crazy looking. And you got roots that hang from the top of the cave. And once you get in, the majority of the cave is pitch black, completely covered in darkness. It's difficult to replicate through a video, but people say that when you walk through this lava tube, that it looks like the walls of the cave flicker like stars. And most of these lava tubes are considered pretty young by cave standards. Like this one, the Kazamura Cave, is like only 500 years old. But some of them do start to stretch back. The oldest one that has been found so far, the Lava River Cave in Oregon, is 700,000 years old. And again, this thing was created by nothing but lava. And after 700,000 years, it is still standing today. 150-foot deep cave created by lava. There's also a cave in Chihuahua, Mexico, that formed right above a magma chamber. And because it formed right over this chamber of magma, the cave is pretty much completely covered in these giant crystals. This cave is 980 feet into the ground and stretches for 98 miles. And originally it was completely submerged in water. And all of that water combined with the minerals in the cave formed these giant gypsum crystals. And you got crystals growing in every direction in this cave. And there are other crystal caves, but this is the biggest. The crystals in this cave are the largest crystals ever found on the planet. The largest crystal in the cave is 36 feet long, and these things stretch out to like 3 feet wide. Now, the caveat to all of this is that this cave is almost completely unhospitable to human beings. The temperature in the cave is consistently 113 degrees Fahrenheit, which wouldn't be so bad because, that's about as hot as the Sahara Desert can get. But then on top of that high temperature, the humidity in the cave consistently sits between 90 to 100%. So the average human being can only last about 10 minutes inside this cave unprotected. And even with a specialized suit, the conditions in the cave are only unbearable for about 45 minutes. But the cave system itself is extremely complex and it's got like multiple chambers connected to it. And each one seems to lead to even more crystal formations. But the temperature and the humidity continues to rise the further you travel into these chambers. So the people that explored it were only able to make it through about 3 chambers. But again, this is all just a combination of rocks and water acting on the elements within it. And again, where you have water and you have rock, you have the potential for cavernous areas to form. Another example of this is canyons. That heavy water pressure just cuts through the rocks and creates these canyons. And one of the biggest is obviously the Grand Canyon. It's one of the biggest canyons in the world. This thing is 277 miles long and drops down 6,000 feet into the earth. And it's a really ancient site. It's supposed to date back like 6 million years. And it is heavily associated with the Native Americans. The natives were actually living in the canyon going back like thousands of years ago. You got so many Native American tribes linked to the Grand Canyon. Even still today, the descendants of the Havasupai tribe are still living inside the canyon. And you got like 6 other Native American tribe descendants living either on the edge or the rim of the canyon. And again, all of these tribes are descended from the original native tribes that actually lived inside this canyon. And there's plenty of space for it because there is estimated to be about 1,000 caves that have formed within this canyon. And out of those thousands of caves, only about 300 have actually been explored or officially recorded. Supposedly only 30% of the overall canyon has actually been explored. And you have so many small hollow areas inside the canyon that a lot of people think could be entrances into even larger cavernous areas within it. And looking at it, it's hard not to question what is beyond that. Is it a larger cavernous area? We really don't know because caving within the canyon is illegal. And they say that the reason for that is, to avoid vandalism, for preservation of the caves, which does make sense because the caves have been vandalized before. People leaving graffiti and carving things into the caves. And so because of that, every single cave in the canyon is completely blocked off and constantly being monitored. But you got to wonder if there's more to it because pretty much a common consensus amongst all these native tribes that the Hopi Indians are the oldest Native American tribe. And within the Grand Canyon, there is over 5,000 petroglyphs linking back to the Hopi tribe. It is the largest collection of Native American petroglyphs ever found. And these petroglyphs have survived like hundreds of years of exposure to the elements, to the wind, to the sun, to the rain. And one of the Hopi legends that was passed down from generation to generation was that they encountered these beings that they called the ant people, and that these ant people actually saved the Hopi tribe from some sort of cataclysmic event by taking them to where they lived underground, and that these beings taught them a lot of things, shared a lot of knowledge, and that they specifically helped the ones that were faithful to them. And they do have petroglyphs that depict these ant people that they supposedly encountered. And when you look at the depiction, they look very much like what the Zulu were describing as the Ndambulu, and again, how the Mesoamericans were describing Kaizen, that smaller frame with the larger head. Now, the Navajo Indians that oversee the Grand Canyon right now, they actually refer to these beings as the Anasazi, which translates to the ancient ones and also the ancient enemy, because they have stories of these beings living underground and coming up to kill and eat their victims. But it definitely seems like there was some sort of knowledge passed down. And then we got Blyde River Canyon in Mpumalanga, South Africa, which is considered the largest green canyon in the world. So basically a canyon with grasslands and plant life in it. This thing is 16 miles long, over 2,460 feet deep. And the water that originally created the canyon is actually still running through it, which is now, the Blyde River. What's interesting is that Blyde Canyon actually has quite a few small hollow sections within it that could potentially lead to deeper cave systems, just like the Grand Canyon. And just like Grand Canyon, none of these cavernous areas in this canyon are accessible to the public. And a lot of these other canyons are filled with caves just like this. And with all this water moving through the rocks to form these canyons, it's easy to see why. But even without water, these cavities can open up in the earth. All it takes is the smallest crack within a rock. And as that crack starts to widen and split, the rock is pulled apart and you get tectonic caves. One of the biggest being the Harpia caves in France. And this is another cave that is prehistoric. Millions of years of rock layers splitting apart and folding on top of each other to form this cave. When you look at it, you can literally see the layers of rocks stacked on top of each other, almost like they're sandwiched together and naturally compiled to form this cave. And it's crazy to think when you're looking at these layers, you're actually looking at millennia after millennia of rocks that have divided and piled up into this formation over thousands of years. Now, the actual passageway into the cave itself is actually pretty small. It's only like a couple of feet in. And after those few feet, it reaches a point where you cannot go any further because the cave is enclosed by rock at that point. But it's speculated that beyond those few feet, that this cave goes much deeper into the earth. Because when you look at it from a distance, it looks like it extends out like a tunnel, like it could potentially go so much deeper into the earth. And there's actually old stories from the local people there about these mythological gods called Lamias inhabiting the cave in the distant past, and that it was supposed to be like a door to another world, and that these Lamias would enchant people and pull them into the cave. The word Lamia actually translates to Lilith in Latin, because the name's supposed to go back to these Mesopotamian demons. And we know in Judaism and Mesopotamian mythology, Lilith is considered the goddess of the underworld and the mother of demons. She was supposed to have created this demonic offspring. And again, according to the story, these were the beings that were inhabiting these caves. But we know for sure this cave has been around for millions of years, and it was formed by cracks in the rock splitting apart over time. And we know sometimes when these cavernous areas form in the earth, whether it's caused by water or, just the forces of rock pulling apart, sometimes we won't even know that these caverns exist until they open up as sinkholes. And they're actually very rare. They don't form very often. There might be about 1,000 worldwide. And the province of Guangxi in China actually has the most. And not just the most, they also have the largest. There's over 30 giant sinkholes all packed into this one region in Guangxi, because you got a lot of limestone in this region, the type of rock that water passes through the easiest, to ultimately form these cavities. And the biggest sinkhole out of the 30 is called Shaojai Tiakang, which translates to heavenly pit. And it is the biggest sinkhole in the world. It is 2,220 feet deep, 1,762 feet wide, and 2,000 feet long. Just to get down into it, you need layers and layers of rope. And once you get down into it, there's actually a forest that formed inside this sinkhole. And this forest has trees that get up to 130 feet tall. There's like thousands of recorded plant species just inside this sinkhole. And the sinkhole itself leads into two separate cave systems. And we're talking about two massive caves that go even deeper than the sinkhole. These things go down another 984 feet into the ground. They equal to about 236 million cubic feet of open space. And you got an underground river down there that formed from the water that created these caves. And sometimes you get massive waterfalls that flow into the caves. It's crazy. This is basically a cave within a cave, a giant sinkhole that leads to a giant cave complex. And again, all of this is formed from water. It actually pales in comparison to even the largest known cave in the world. We're talking about a combination of water, lava, and rocks splitting apart to form this cave. And all of those elements combined together has formed the largest known cave in the world, Hang Sung Dung in Vietnam. And the name translates to mountain river cave because, again, it was created from water, tectonic, and volcanic activity. And it's the largest cave in the world overall by its combined size, length, and width. It's got about 1 billion cubic feet of space within it. This thing is massive. This thing is in the middle of the jungle, surrounded by mountains. And it took about 3 million years to form, with all the forces acting on the rock to create it. The cave opening alone is 3 miles wide. You could literally fit 68 Boeing 777 planes in the entrance into the cave. And it's a 328-foot drop just to get down into the cave. And the cave itself goes down as deep as 490 feet and it stretches for like 5 miles. And you got areas in there as wide as 500 feet. And as you move through it, there's about 1,500 feet of space that leads up to a giant underground river. And after going through the river, the cave descends down into the deepest known regions. And all throughout the deeper parts of the cave and near the openings are all these different giant rock formations. And some of these rock formations have features that you usually only see inside canyons, like rocks cut into stack formations, summits, ridges. Literally in this cave, you have mountainous regions that are separated from the main rock, forming the walls of the cave. And in the middle of all this, there is a massive valley in this cave with an almost carved out rocky passage at the center of it. And just beyond that valley is a second giant opening above the cave, where again, because of all that sunlight, an underground forest formed. And it's not just any type of forest, it is a literal rainforest that has developed its own ecosystem because of all the water from that massive underground river and those giant openings into the caves, those skylights. This thing literally has its own weather system. You have clouds and rain that form inside the cave. And the temperature inside the cave sits between 74 and 77 degrees Fahrenheit. And it is the only cave that we know of like this that has developed its own ecosystem. The craziest part is this cave is a part of a massive network of caverns and chambers. So it actually extends out even further and still has not been fully explored. And this is all going on just below the surface of the planet, deep within the crust. But none of this that we know of is taking place deeper into the mantle. But remember, the way that they distinguish the different layers within the earth, the crust, the mantle, the core, is through seismic discontinuities. And these discontinuities sit between each layer. And when seismic waves hit these discontinuities, they don't move the way they would normally move through the rest of the earth. They end up bouncing in different directions instead of moving through the earth smoothly. And each one of these discontinuities transitions you into the next layer of the earth where these waves start moving normally again. And the majority of these discontinuities can be summed up to changes in the rock composition as you transition from one layer to another, moving from one form of rock to another. That is until you get to the discontinuity between the upper and lower mantle, what they literally call the transition zone. And again, this is an area between the upper and lower mantle where seismic waves move abnormally. And this area starts at about 410 kilometers down into the earth and ends at 660 kilometers. So basically it starts at about 254 miles and goes down as deep as 410 miles. And because it ends at that 660 kilometer depth, they also call this area the 660 kilometer discontinuity. But the average thickness of this layer is 242 kilometers. So about 150 miles thick, which would be about the full length from New York to Delaware. And again, this transition zone is in the middle of the mantle. And not too long ago, while studying the rocks that come up from this area, they found evidence that there may actually be water located in this transition zone. And not just a small amount of water, but possibly more water than all of the Earth's oceans combined. Now, the one thing is, it's not water in its liquid form. It's water that's been trapped inside the rocks in a molecular form. Because of the higher pressures in this region of the Earth, the hydrogen and oxygen molecules are absorbed into the rocks in this region. And almost all the rocks in this transition zone are saturated with the imprint of this water. And because of that, they are referring to this thing as an ocean that is encircling the entire Earth inside this transition zone.
I am Hari Srinivasan, and today we're going to talk about a massive ocean that actually encircles the entire Earth that you have never heard of, and it might have as much water as all the oceans in the world have today. Sound pretty amazing? Well, scientists have been working on this for the past couple of months. There have been a couple of big research findings. One of them just happened a few days ago, and I am joined now by Stephen Jacobson, the Department of Earth and Planetary Science at Northwestern University. You found something 400 to 700 kilometers below the Earth that could be water? Explain.
So let me put the depth in context first. 400 to 600 kilometers depth in the Earth is far deeper than we've ever been able to drill.
I'm going to put up a map here, so to speak, so that people understand where we're talking about. When you say the outer core and the crust and so forth, I mean, we are living on the top teensy-weensy tiny little bit of this. So this is what you're talking about. This is 600, 400 kilometers down is this little blue line, right?
That's right. So the blue line represents a layer of the mantle, the solid rocky mantle that we call the transition zone.
So this thin blue line, this is about, I don't know, let's say if it's on this apple analogy, about a centimeter or two below. But how do we know that there's any water in there?
One particular mineral, which we call ringwoodite. So this would be a mechanism by which high-pressure minerals in the mantle could absorb the components of water.
So we're looking at a picture of this ringwoodite. This is one of the very few elements of ringwoodite ever pulled out of the Earth. But tell me, so you're talking about water that's in this rock, but not in the type of form that we drink, but really just in its molecular form.
That's exactly right. So the circular hole is a little sample chamber inside of the diamond anvil cell. The blue-colored object is a crystal of ringwoodite that I synthesized in the laboratory. Now, that ringwoodite that you're looking at is at a pressure equivalent to 700 kilometers depth. And the ringwoodite has about the same amount of water in it, around 1%, as the ringwoodite discovered by Graham Pearson at the University of Alberta. So his discovery was really remarkable in two ways. One, it was actually the first ringwoodite that we'd ever recovered from the Earth's deep mantle. And two, he found that that ringwoodite was full of water. And by full, I mean that 1 weight percent of H2O is about the maximum amount of water that we can put into ringwoodite. And what Brandon Schmant from the University of New Mexico and I have done is to address the question of how expansive this hydration layer might be in the mantle. And so this is basically a study where we're connecting that rock cycle to the water cycle.
I mean, when we think of the water cycle, when we're in high school biology or even elementary or middle school biology, we think of the water cycle as basically from where we are above us, right? So basically steam evaporates on a hot day, the water goes up into a cloud, it hits a mountain, it comes down, and then down a stream, down a river, into the ocean again. You're saying that there's actually a water cycle that's going on 300 miles below the Earth.
Yes, so it occurs on a much longer time scale. The ocean crust is formed at the mid-ocean ridges, and as it spreads away from that spreading center, it reacts with the ocean water to form a hydrothermally altered rock that we call serpentinite. I have a piece of serpentinite right here. I might hold it up for just a moment. It's green.
Okay. Serpentinite, all right. And where does that come? How deep is that rock?
Well, this you can find in the crust and it's hydrothermally altered ocean crust. But this rock that I'm holding contains about 12 weight % of water. So just a 5-pound piece of serpentinite contains enough water inside of it, not liquid water, but the components of water, like an ingredient. One 5-pound piece of this rock has enough water inside of it for a tall drink of water. And this is what's going down into the mantle. Now, the ability for the mantle to contain more H2O equivalent than the oceans also suggests something about the equilibrium or the balance between the water in the oceans and the interior. Might think of another analogy of a sponge. If you want to create an ocean or a little lake on top of a sponge, you would need to fill the sponge before you could support liquid water on top of the sponge. So if the properties of the mantle are as it looks like we're finding, if the transition zone of the mantle can absorb at least as much, if not more, water than the oceans, perhaps the mantle is buffering somehow the amount of liquid water in the oceans.
And again, this isn't water in a liquid form. It's water that's broken down to a molecular level because of the density and the high temperatures in this part of the earth. The water literally fuses into the rocks in this region. But in order for that to take place, the water has to get down there first. And so just like we have water cycling into the crust, that same water is also going down into the mantle and even deeper down into this transition zone. And this isn't an instantaneous process. This is something that's taken place over a long period of time, hundreds of thousands of years. So this water has been cycling down to this depth throughout multiple different stages of the earth. And throughout that time, this water has had a chance to impact this area as it cycles through it. And that's something that they found, that when seismic waves go through this region, the S waves disappear in certain places, which suggests that this isn't a completely solid layer and that there are depressed sections all throughout this region. So it seems like the water that has been cycling through this region over thousands of years has had a strong effect on it, which makes sense because, again, remember, wherever you have water and you have rock, you have the potential for cavernous areas to form. And we know generally this is a process that happens over thousands, sometimes millions of years. And there's definitely something to this because in 1994, you had the second largest earthquake in recorded history in Bolivia. It was an 8.2 on the Richter scale. And so, of course, this thing sent waves throughout the entire earth. And they were able to use those waves to map the earth on a large scale. They were able to see parts of this transition zone that had rough and almost mountainous sections. They're actually referring to them as mountains because in that same boundary with these structures are smooth plains. And we know there's just no way you can have mountains and plains in a completely solid object. In order to have mountains, you just by default, you need open space around it. And they're saying that these mountains are sitting right at the base of the transition zone. So the foot of the mountains, the lowest part of the mountains, stops right at that 660-kilometer depth. And when they mapped the top of the transition zone, none of this was there. It's not until they started going lower down that they started seeing these mountainous regions and these plains. So it's literally like the layout of a landscape. And from what they could see, these mountains could be bigger than anything that we have on the surface, which is crazy because you got to think the tallest mountain on the surface is Mount Everest, and that's 29,000 feet. So, just how tall are these mountains? But they're saying that the topography of this 660-kilometer boundary is just as complex as the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians, just as complex as anything that we have on the surface. When they thermally mapped this region, they said that the results were not particularly encouraging because basically there was just no way that this could be possible because they found temperatures of 60, 90 to 120 Kelvin just above the middle of the mantle. So we're talking about well below freezing temperatures between -300 and -200 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was the same readings just below the transition zone, around 60 Kelvin, negative 300 degrees. And then in the middle of the mantle, inside the transition zone, they were getting readings of 60 or even possibly 300 Kelvin. 300 Kelvin, we're talking about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Temperatures that we would normally expect to find inside of a cave, nowhere near that estimated 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. So after seeing these numbers, they basically said we got to improve the grid system and come up with a better way to thermally map the Earth, because these numbers just did not make any sense. But as they continued to map out what was going on down there, they noticed that when the oceanic crust would sink down deeper into the Earth, that it would go straight to this transition zone. And that this oceanic crust was actually sitting at the top of the transition zone. This oceanic crust is literally layered across the top of the transition zone like slabs. And these were actually cold slabs that are affecting the temperature of the transition zone. And they're not just sitting on the top, they're also on the bottom and even penetrating through the transition zone, almost like stalactites in a cave. And these slabs are not moving. They're stagnant right at the top and the bottom of the transition zone, almost like they're literally trapped in place, like a barrier around this region. And they say it's literally like this area is shielded from any of the geothermal activity going on in the lower mantle, but that these slabs have helped to spread this area open even more. And there's no type of anomalies like this going on below this 660 kilometer discontinuity. And they've been trying to figure out why these slabs are not moving, but they really don't know why this is happening. Again, like an anomaly in this particular region of the mantle, but there's literally no signs of these things moving. Again, they're acting like a barrier above and below the transition zone, and they're staying at that cold temperature. It's like they're completely unaffected by the thermal activity around them. Now, one of the things that they found that could be causing this, I found a couple of years ago when they were able to sample diamonds that came up from this region, from a mine in Botswana, because Africa is the land of diamonds. They were able to recover a diamond from this region, and they found that this diamond contained water, and not liquid water, but actually water in the form of ice. And it's a completely different form of ice than we have here on the surface of the Earth. They actually call it ice 7. They can form at almost any temperature. Literally, this ice will be at a solid state, even at room temperature. Only thing is, it's only stable at high densities. So outside of a high density environment, it goes back to a liquid form. This ice is only stable and can really only exist at this 660 kilometer region. From what they think, this region is filled with this ice and most likely trapped in these slabs. Now, you would think if this ice can only form at extreme levels of density, now where the transition zone has to be this extremely dense environment. And if it is that dense, number one, this transition zone should completely collapse on itself due to all the atmospheric pressure. And also would just be nearly impossible for anything to survive at that depth. If you think about the ocean, the deeper you go down, the more dense it gets, because the deeper you go down, the more water you have on top of you. And the density just continues to increase. The more and more that water builds up on top, to the point where when you get so far into the ocean, so you can only go so far before you get crushed. But we also know that the density of an object can decrease when you add pockets or cavities. You can have an extremely dense object that will lose some of that density when it's placed in an environment that's more dense, which is why you can put a bowling ball in water, it will float. Super dense object becomes less dense in that denser environment as the air pressure escapes through those holes or cavities. And this is something that we could be seeing with this discontinuity, and could be the reason why it's not collapsing on itself, especially with how large it is. So literally circling the entire Earth. And because of the size of this thing and all the complexity to it, they actually call this thing the second continent, because you got the continental crust on the surface of the earth where the continents and all the earth's land formations sit. And then just below that, you have this transition zone that has all these complexities and formations. And so it's looked at as the second continental crust below the continental crust on the Earth's surface. And again, when they imaged the Earth, they got a better idea of exactly where this region sits. And even though the average depth is at 660 kilometers, they were able to get more of an accurate measurement of the exact depth of where this thing sits. And when they measured it, it showed that the depths dropped between 632 to 666 kilometers, which means that this thing is actually dropping down 413 miles or 666 kilometers. And so because of that, many times they will refer to this thing as the 666 kilometer discontinuity when talking about it on a technical level, because technically this is where this region sits. Because just below those 666 kilometers, it looks like the velocity in the mantle just starts to rapidly increase. Again, indicating that there is some level of structure above it at this 666 kilometer depth. Now, if you remember in the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth, it came out in 1959. And the whole reason that they decided to go down and explore, because they had found a rock that came up from deep within the earth. And it had that inscription engraved into it from the explorer that had already been there. 3 straight lines carved into the rock in a succession, one line after the next. Well, if you look into the Hebrew alphabet, you're going to see this same line. And in Hebrew, they call this a vav. It is the 6th letter in the Hebrew alphabet. And so because of that, it has a numeric value of 6. It is literally the representation of the number 6 in gematria. So when you write out 3 of these lines, you get 666. And in the movie, these 3 lines are used almost like a beacon to guide them toward the quote unquote center of the earth. Because all throughout the movie, as they move deeper into the earth, they keep coming across these 3 lines, letting them know that they're on the right path. The closer they get to it, the more and more they see these lines, which again in Hebrew is going to give you 666. And then we got the transition zone dropping down to 666 kilometers. So it's almost like they're saying this is the center of the earth, or the central point of focus inside the earth. And we've got so many different people in the past saying that there are entrances deep into the earth at both the north and the south poles. And there's some evidence for this because, number one, when you spin a spherical object in a constant motion at a high rate of speed, similar to the Earth's rotation, that sphere starts to flatten out at the top and the bottom and bulge out on the sides and basically becomes an oblate spheroid. And then if you put that same spherical object in a microgravity environment and you add elements into the interior of it and send it into a spinning motion at a high rate of speed, not only does it press down into more of an oblate spheroid shape, but the majority of the energy migrates toward the center and extends to both the top and the bottom of the sphere and almost creates sort of a cylindrical mass right at the center of the sphere. So if the earth is spinning and taking on this oblate spheroid formation, you would expect to see something similar going on, but possibly on a larger scale because of all the electromagnetic activity and all the other forces acting on the planet. It would create this kind of like a torus effect where a good portion of the energy moves towards the center and extends out at the top and the bottom. And all of that energy and all that force will create cavities or holes at both the top and the bottom, at both the north and the south poles.